His hand grabbed her wrist before she could step back. The entire field froze. She turned slowly, not in panic, not in fear, and looked at the sergeant with eyes that had seen wars he'd only read about in training manuals. "Don't touch me," 3 words, quiet as a blade being drawn. And in that silence, something shifted, something that would shake Camp Pendleton to its foundation before the day was over. If this story moves you, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The trouble started, as trouble so often does, with a man who thought he already knew everything he needed to know. Sergeant Derek Collins had been stationed at Camp Pendleton for going on 6 years, and in those 6 years he had developed something that he mistook for wisdom. It was not wisdom, it was habit dressed up in authority's clothing. He knew the faces on this base, he knew the ranks. He knew the rhythms of the morning, the way boots hit the dirt at 500. The way diesel engines growled to life near the motor pool. The way junior Marines moved a little faster when they thought someone was watching them. He knew all of it. So when a woman he didn't recognize walked through the restricted entrance on a Tuesday morning in October, something inside Derek Collins went tight. She didn't look like a threat. That was the first thing he registered, and it annoyed him more than actual danger would have. Danger, he understood. Danger had a shape. But this woman, she was something else entirely. She wore a simple tactical uniform, no patches, no insignia he could identify. She carried a small notebook pressed against her side. Her hair was pulled back without ceremony. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't performing confidence, the way people who needed to prove something always performed it. She was simply walking, and the way she walked, steady, unhurried, like someone who had walked into 1,000 places that weren't expecting her. That was what stopped Derek cold. He watched her from across the field for longer than he should have. Then he nudged Corporal Ryan Foster with his elbow. "You know her?" Ryan squinted. No. Derek looked to his left. Private Ethan Brooks was already watching too, arms crossed, trying to figure out the same puzzle. "Neither do I," Derek said slowly. "And this is a restricted area." He started walking toward her. Olivia Hayes had arrived at Camp Pendleton 40 minutes earlier, and she had already learned more than she expected. She had watched a junior Marine get publicly humiliated in front of his entire unit for filling out a form incorrectly, not corrected. Humiliated, his face red, his jaw clenched. His eyes focused on a fixed point somewhere over his sergeant's shoulder, the way soldiers learn to disappear and themselves when enduring something they couldn't fight back against. She had watched a female corporal try to report something to a staff sergeant, watched him wave her off without looking up from his clipboard. She had watched 3 separate groups of enlisted men go quiet the moment a particular set of officers passed by, not the respectful quiet of discipline, but the hunched, held breath quiet of people waiting for something to pass. She had written 3 words in her notebook: culture of fear. Then she had kept walking. This was the work, not the glamorous part of military intelligence, not the briefings in Washington, not the classified reports, not the commendations. This was the part that mattered, coming in without a flag flying ahead of her. Coming in as nobody, coming in as someone who could be dismissed so that the people who dismissed others would show her exactly who they were without even meaning to. She had done this before. Fort Bragg, 29 Palms, a naval station in Virginia that had been covering up a harassment complaint chain for almost 2 years. She knew what she was looking for, and she knew how to stay invisible long enough to find it. What she hadn't planned for was Sergeant Derek Collins deciding she was his problem. She heard him coming before she saw him. Boots on gravel had a particular sound when someone was moving with intention toward someone else. She didn't speed up. She didn't slow down. She simply allowed herself to know he was coming and continued toward the documentation office she had been assigned to observe. "Hey," she stopped, turned. Derek Collins was younger than she expected. Late 20s, maybe 30, broad shoulders. The kind of face that had learned early that setting it hard made people take him more seriously. Behind him, two more men, one with the ease of someone who followed without thinking too much, and one, the younger one, Private Brooks, whose eyes were doing something more complicated. Watching, uncertain. "Can I help you?" Olivia said. "That's what I was going to ask you." Derek's voice carried the weight of a man who had used it to move people before. "You lost?" "No. You know this is restricted?" "Yes." Ryan Foster laughed a little, the way people laugh when they think someone is about to embarrass themselves. "Then you know you shouldn't be here." Olivia looked at Derek Collins, the way a doctor looks at a patient who is about to tell her there's nothing wrong with them. "I have authorization." Derek took a step forward. "Everybody says that. Then, perhaps you should verify it before assuming otherwise." Something moved across Derek's face, not quite anger yet. Something closer to offense. The particular offense of a man who is used to people adjusting to his presence. And this woman was not adjusting. "Authorization from who?" "From the appropriate authority." "Which you are welcome to verify." Derek's jaw tightened. "I'm going to need to see identification." "I understand that." Olivia held his gaze. "But I'm not in a position to disclose that identification to you directly. You can call it in." "Why can't you show me?" "Because my instructions don't permit it." "That's not how this works," Sergeant Olivia said quietly. "I understand your job is to secure this area. I respect that, but the way to do your job right now is to call it in. Not to stand in front of me, demanding I've explained I cannot provide." Derek stared at her. "You're telling me how to do my job." "I'm telling you how to do it correctly." The silence between them had weight. Around them, other soldiers were beginning to slow down. Not stopping. Nobody stops on a military base without a reason but slowing. That particular kind of slowing that happens when the air changes. Ryan nudged Derek. "Just call it in. If she's cleared, she's cleared." "She's not acting cleared," Derek muttered. "What does cleared look like, Sergeant?" Olivia asked. Her voice was still calm, still even. "Does it look like someone who's nervous because I'm not nervous? Does it look like someone apologizing because I haven't done anything to apologize for? Or does it look like someone accommodating every demand without question?" She paused. "Because that would make your job very easy, but it wouldn't make either of us safer." From across the field, Gunnery Sergeant Mark Reed had been watching. 24 years, that was how long Marcus had been in. Long enough to have learned that the military was full of two kinds of people, the kind who learned from experience, and the kind who learned to perform experience without actually having it. He could tell the difference in about 90 seconds of observation. Less if the person was moving. He watched the woman standing in front of Derek Collins. Her weight was balanced slightly forward, on her left foot, not a fighting stance, but a ready stance. The kind of stance that came from training so deep it lived in the body, rather than the mind. Her eyes weren't fixed on Derek. They were moving in controlled, subtle arcs, taking in the entire field. Exits, positions, numbers. She was doing a threat assessment in real time while having a conversation, and she wasn't even aware she was doing it, which meant she'd been doing it for so long it was automatic. Marcus had only seen that kind of automatic awareness in people who had operated in very high-stress environments for a very long time. He started walking toward the group. Not quickly. He didn't want to escalate anything. But he wanted to be close when this went sideways because his gut, and 24 years of gut had never steered him badly, was telling him this was about to go somewhere none of them had planned. Derek was running out of patience. He had radio called the front gate and gotten the same strange response Olivia had gotten from the security guard that morning, a long pause. Then, authorization confirmed, no further details. And that infuriated him. In Derek's understanding of the world, authorization came with details. Authorization meant paperwork. Authorization meant chain of command flowing in the direction he could trace. This was something else. "Who authorized you?" "I told you I can't." "Who?" His voice was harder now. "Sergeant Collins." Olivia said his name the way people say the name of someone they've already figured out. "You've confirmed my authorization. Your own command confirmed it." What exactly are you still trying to establish? I'm trying to establish who you are. And I'm telling you that information isn't available to you through this channel. That's not acceptable. That's the situation. Ryan was watching Derek's face now, not Olivia's. He recognized something in Derek's expression, the particular set of features that appeared when Derek had decided something, regardless of whether the decision made sense. Ryan had seen it before. It never went well, Derek, Ryan said quietly. Man, just let it go. She doesn't get to walk around this base and refuse to identify herself. She got authorization. I don't care about the authorization. The words came out harder than Derek intended. He heard himself, reined it back, looked at Olivia. You're going to come with us. Olivia was quiet for a moment. I'm not, she said. Excuse me, I'm not going with you. I have a scheduled observation at 1400, and I intend to keep it. If you have a concern, you can escalate it through your chain of command. I'll be happy to meet with your commanding officer at a time that works for the mission. Your mission, Derek said, and the contempt in his voice was unmistakable now, is not my problem. Then neither am I, Olivia said. She turned to continue walking. Derek's hand moved before his brain caught up with it. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. The field went silent. Not just the people watching the whole field. The engines seemed quieter. The wind dropped. The distant sound of commands on the obstacle course faded into something that felt very far away. Olivia stopped walking. She didn't pull away. She didn't panic. She turned, slowly, and looked down at his hand on her wrist, and then she looked up at his face, and what Derek Collins saw in her eyes, in that moment, was something that would stay with him for the rest of his career. Not fear, not anger, recognition, like she had been in this exact situation before, in a place far more dangerous than Camp Pendleton, and she already knew exactly how it was going to end. Don't touch me, she said, quiet as a blade being drawn. Marcus Reed reached the edge of the gathering crowd just in time to watch Derek Collins refuse to let go. He felt his stomach drop. Collins. Marcus's voice carried the full authority of 24 years. Step back. Derek looked over his shoulder. Something in Marcus's face, not anger, something worse than anger, something that looked almost like grief made Derek's grip loosen slightly. Not entirely, but slightly. She won't identify herself, Derek said. She's in a restricted area and she won't. I said, step back, Sergeant. Gunny, you just put your hands on someone who authorized entry to this base. Marcus's voice was very controlled. That was the most frightening kind of controlled, when someone with the ability to be very loud chose to be very quiet. Take your hand off her wrist. Something complicated moved through the crowd. 30, maybe 40 people watching now, junior Marines. Senior NCOs. A couple of lieutenants who had drifted over, their faces carefully neutral, trying to figure out the situation before committing to a position. Derek let go. Olivia didn't rub her wrist, didn't look at it. Didn't give the interaction any more significance than it had already claimed. She simply looked at Marcus Reed and said, "Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant." Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, the same assessment he'd been running from, across the field, and said quietly, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology on behalf of this unit." Something moved through the crowd at that, ma'am. Not miss. Not lady. The specific formal address of a military man who has just recalibrated his assessment upward. Derek noticed. What are you? Gunny, she's a contractor at best, she's not. Sergeant Collins. Marcus turned to him, and his voice could have stripped paint. I strongly suggest you stop talking right now. Derek stopped talking. Ethan Brooks, standing at the edge of the group, let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He had watched the whole thing and understood almost none of the details, but he understood the shape of it. He understood that something very wrong was in the process of becoming visible, and that the woman standing in the middle of it had known that before any of them did. He looked at her. She was writing something in her notebook. Unhurried, calm, like the last 5 minutes had simply been data she was collecting. Word moved through a military base the way electricity moves through wire. Fast, invisible, unstoppable. By noon, the story had 10 different versions. In one version, the woman had knocked Derek Collins flat with some kind of special forces hand-to-hand technique. In another version, Marcus Reed had come close to arresting Derek on the spot. In another, the woman was a government spy. In another, she was from JAG. In another, she was from somewhere so classified that even the name of the organization would trigger a security review. The only version that mattered was the version nobody was telling yet. Because the truth was still unfolding, and the woman at the center of it was still walking the base, still writing in her notebook, still observing the things she had come to observe, except now she was also observing something she hadn't expected. She was observing what happened to a unit's culture in the hours after something like this. Who rallied around Derek? Who quietly distanced themselves? Who came to find Marcus Reed and say something low-voiced and urgent? Who looked at the ground when they passed the spot where it had happened? Who looked straight ahead? Who seemed, in the small shifts of their faces and the careful calibration of their words, afraid? There were more of them than she had hoped, the afraid ones. That was the data that mattered most. Marcus Reed found her at 1400. She was in the documentation office, as she had said she would be, reviewing personnel records with the methodical focus of someone who had done this enough times to know exactly what the pattern of missing documents looked like. Marcus knocked on the open door. Olivia looked up. "Gunnery Sergeant Reed, you know my name. I know everyone's name." She said it without apology. "Please come in. Close the door." He did. He sat across from her without being asked, because he was the kind of man who understood that some conversations needed to happen sitting down, and this was one of them. "You're not a contractor," he said. "No. You've been walking this base for," he paused, calculating. "At least 3 days, 7. His jaw tightened slightly. "Not from anger, from something more complicated. 7 days. "And nobody picked it up." "One person did," Olivia said. "Yesterday afternoon, near the motor pool. Master Sergeant Calloway. He noticed the way I was watching. He didn't say anything to me, but he also made a point of walking through the areas I'd been observing for about an hour afterward. Like he was trying to see what I'd seen." Marcus considered this. "Calloway's one of the good ones, I know." A pause. "The others aren't?" he asked. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her notebook and turned it so he could see the page. Marcus looked at it. The handwriting was small, neat, precise. He read for about 30 seconds before he looked back up at her. His face had changed. "How much of this did you already know coming in?" he said. "Enough to come in. And how much did you find?" Olivia looked at him steadily. "Enough to stay." Marcus sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that is not the absence of thought, but the presence of too much of it. "The complaints that went missing," he said finally. "I reported them. I know you did. And nothing happened." "I know that too." I thought maybe he started again. "I'm not the kind of man who thinks things will take care of themselves. I've seen too much to believe that. But I thought maybe putting it in writing through the right channels." He shook his head. "I'm aware of how naive that sounds." "It doesn't sound naive," Olivia said. "It sounds like someone who believed in the system enough to use it." She paused. "I'm here because the system didn't work. That's not a failure on your part. That's a failure in the chain above you, and it's what I'm here to document." Marcus was quiet again. "What happens after documentation?" he said. "That depends on what I find. And what do you think you'll find?" Olivia looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I think I'll find that what happened this morning wasn't an accident. It was a symptom, and I think the sickness runs deeper than this unit." Marcus nodded slowly. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had known the diagnosis for a long time and had finally found a doctor willing to say it out loud. At 1700, Derek Collins was called before his CO. He walked in, expecting to be defended. He had spent the afternoon building a case in his head. The woman hadn't identified herself, hadn't cooperated, had been evasive, had been in a restricted area, had made his job impossible. He had the facts on his side. He had done what any security-minded NCO would do. He sat down. His CO, Major Karen Shields, looked at him across the desk with an expression he had never seen from her before. Not anger, not disappointment. Those he could have handled. She looked tired. "Sergeant Collins," she said, "do you know what an independent command assessment is?" "Ma'am, do you know what it is?" Derek frowned. "It's when higher command sends someone in to evaluate a unit without." He stopped. Something cold moved through him. Without advance notice, Karen Shields said quietly. Without rank displayed, without the unit being aware they're being assessed. She paused. So that they can be observed as they actually are, rather than as they would perform to be. The silence was enormous. "The woman you grabbed this morning," Shields said, "has conducted 7 of these assessments. She has 6 commendations for the reports she has written and the changes those reports produced." Another pause. "And she has filed a formal complaint, Sergeant, which I am now required to process." Derek's face had gone very still. "I was securing the—" "You ignored confirmed authorization. You escalated an encounter that did not require escalation. You made physical contact with a superior officer after being explicitly warned not to." Major Shields' voice was flat and factual in the way that only made things worse. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He did. He understood it in the way a man understands the moment a door closes behind him and he hears the lock engage. "Who is she?" he said. His voice came out smaller than he intended. Karen Shields looked at him for a moment. "Her name is Commander Olivia Hayes," she said. "Joint Operations Command. And she was here to find out whether this unit could be trusted to protect the people it's responsible for." She stood. "She has her answer, Sergeant, as do I." That night Ethan Brooks sat outside the barracks and thought about what he had watched. He had watched a woman refuse to be moved by a man who had probably moved a lot of people in his life. He had watched Marcus Reed, who had the respect of nearly everyone on the base, look at that woman and say "ma'am" like it meant something. He had watched Derek Collins, who was always so certain, go very, very still when the ground shifted under him. And he thought about something his grandmother had told him once, when he was about 12 years old and he'd been talking about some kid at school who was always getting into fights, always proving himself, always needing to be the biggest thing in the room. "Baby," she had said, "the person who has to tell you they're powerful usually isn't. The person who already is doesn't need to say a word." He hadn't understood it then. He thought he was starting to understand it now. He looked up at the night sky over Camp Pendleton, at the stars that were the same stars his grandmother could see from her porch in Georgia, and he thought, "I need to be better than what I watched today. Not just better than Derek. Better than his own silence. Better than standing on the edge of something wrong and not knowing how to step into it." He had watched Olivia Hayes do exactly that, walk straight into the middle of a situation that was bigger than it looked, without a uniform full of rank to protect her, without anyone beside her, without any visible weapon except the absolute unshakable certainty of someone who knew exactly who she was. He wanted to know someday what that felt like. He didn't know yet that the woman he was thinking about was still in her borrowed office at that very moment filling out reports. That would change the shape of the next several months at Camp Pendleton in ways none of them could yet imagine. He didn't know that she had written his name in her notebook, too. Not with a problem attached to it, with a note that said, "Watch this one." He's paying attention. The night was quiet. Somewhere across the base, a gate opened and closed. Tomorrow, everything would begin to change. But tonight, the only thing Ethan Brooks knew for certain was that he had been in the presence of someone extraordinary and had almost missed it because she hadn't announced herself. That, he thought, was the whole point. That had always been the whole point. And the story of Commander Olivia Hayes and Camp Pendleton, the real story, the one that would be told in mess halls and training rooms for years afterward, was only beginning. The complaint hit Major Karen Shields' desks at 6:30 the next morning, and by 700 it had already traveled up 2 levels of command in a way that complaints almost never did at Camp Pendleton. That was the first sign that something had fundamentally changed. The second sign was that Sergeant Derek Collins didn't show up for morning formation. His bunkmates said he'd been there at 500. He'd gotten dressed, laced his boots, sat on the edge of his bed for a long time without moving, and then walked out without saying where he was going. Nobody had seen him since. That information moved through the NCO ranks by 715, and by 730 it had reached Marcus Reed, who received it with the particular stillness of a man who was not surprised but was worried in a way he hadn't expected to be. Because Derek Collins, for all his faults, and Marcus had catalogued them carefully over the years, the way you catalogued the faults of someone you were responsible for was not the kind of man who disappeared. He was the kind of man who dug in, who argued, who made himself immovable. His going missing was more alarming than his defiance, because it meant something in him had broken in a way that anger couldn't fix. Marcus found him at the east fence line, sitting on the ground, with his back against the chain link, staring at nothing. "Collins." Derek didn't look up. "I don't want a lecture, Gunny." "Good, because I'm not here to give you one." Marcus sat down beside him, which was not something people expected of Marcus Reed. He was not a man who sat on the ground with his back against a fence. He was a man who stood, who occupied space with intention, who made the room he was in feel organized just by being in it. His sitting down beside Derek was as deliberate as anything Marcus Reed ever did. "I'm here because you're one of mine, even when you're wrong. And yesterday you were wrong." She what? Derek stopped. "She made you feel like you didn't know what was happening," Marcus said. "She walked in without a label, and you couldn't file her. You couldn't fit her into what you already understood. So you pushed back. And then you kept pushing, because stopping would have meant admitting you were wrong, and you don't know how to do that in front of people." He paused. "That about right?" The silence stretched. "Close enough," Derek said finally. "That's not a character flaw that's unique to you," Marcus said. "It's a training failure. It means somewhere in your career, someone taught you that certainty was the same thing as competence, and you believed them." He looked straight ahead. "It's a lie that a lot of good men have had destroyed by a bad moment. The difference is what you do next." Derek was quiet for a long time. A group of junior Marines jogged past in the distance, their cadence faint and rhythmic. "She was writing everything down," Derek said, "the whole time. Even when I had her wrist, I know." "What's in that notebook, Gunny?" Marcus considered. "I don't know all of it, but I know enough to know that whatever's in it is going to matter. For this unit and beyond." He stood. "Get back to your post, Sergeant. Do your job, and this time do it the way it's supposed to be done." Derek looked up at him. His face had the particular sonnen of someone who had spent the night taking apart something they'd believed in and hadn't finished putting it back together yet. "What if the way it's supposed to be done is nothing like what I've been doing?" Marcus looked down at him. "Then you start over." Today he paused. "That's not weakness, Collins. That's the hardest thing a man in your position can do." He walked away. Derek sat there for another 3 minutes. Then he stood, brushed the dirt off his uniform, and went back to work. That was the moment, though he wouldn't understand it for weeks, that Derek Collins began to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the seed of it was there, planted in the dirt by the east fence line. At 800 on a Wednesday morning, by a gunnery sergeant who had understood something crucial, that the man most in need of correction is not always the man who deserves to be abandoned. Commander Olivia Hayes noted his return to post in her notebook at 807. She had been watching. She was always watching. And what she saw in Derek Collins' face when he returned to duty was something she hadn't expected to see for at least several more days, the beginning of genuine reckoning. Not performance, not the strategic humility of a man trying to save his career. Something real, something cracked open. She added a second notation beneath the first. Reed is the reason this unit hasn't completely broken down. Find out what's keeping him here. That question would be answered sooner than she expected. Corporal Ryan Foster was the one who brought her the first piece of real evidence she hadn't already known about. He found her in the documentation office at 1000, knocked 3 times, and stood in the doorway with a particular stiffness of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was now terrified that rehearsal had been inadequate. "Commander Hayes," he said. She looked up from the personnel files spread across the table. "Corporal Foster, come in." He came in. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the room, like he was reporting for inspection, shoulder squared, jaw set, but his hands were doing something careful, something controlled. The way hands moved when their owner was trying very hard not to let them show what his face was already showing. He was scared, not of her, of what he was about to say. "I want to report something," he said. "All right. I didn't know yesterday. I didn't know who you were. And I want to. I'm not saying that as an excuse for what happened. I'm saying it because I want you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not. I'm not doing this to get Derek in more trouble." He stopped. Swallowed. "I'm doing this 'cause it's the right thing to do and I should have done it 6 months ago." Olivia set down her pen. She gave him her full attention, which was a particular kind of attention, complete, unhurried, without judgment, that made people feel both seen and safe at the same time. "Sit down, Corporal," she said. He sat. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Take your time." Ryan Foster started from the beginning. It took 45 minutes. By the time he finished, Olivia had filled 6 pages in her notebook, and the room felt different, heavier, and also somehow cleaner, the way air feels after a storm has broken what was unbearable. What Ryan described was not one incident. It was a pattern. It was the kind of pattern that built itself slowly, one small compromise at a time, until the people inside it couldn't see it anymore, because they were standing too close to the architecture that held it up. "It had started," he said, 18 months ago. A new staff officer had come in, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Harmon, and he had brought with him a management philosophy that looked, from the outside, like strength. He was decisive. He was demanding. He set high standards and he held people to them, publicly, visibly, without what he called the softness of private correction. In Harmon's framework, accountability meant spectacle. It meant making an example. It meant ensuring that when one person failed, everyone else saw the consequences, because fear, he believed, was more efficient than trust. Within 6 months, the unit's performance metrics had improved. Within a year, the complaints had started. Not formal complaints, those disappeared, and Ryan described exactly how they disappeared, which was worse than anything Olivia had imagined. They didn't disappear because people stayed silent. They disappeared because people who tried to speak were reassigned. Quietly, with clean paperwork, sent to other units under the stated reason of force redistribution. The transfers were legal. The reasoning was unchallengeable, and the message was devastating in its clarity. Speak, and you move. Don't speak, and you stay. For soldiers, with families, with roots, with reasons to stay, the choice was not a choice. The ones who remained learned to adjust. They learned to perform confidence they didn't feel. They learned the specific choreography of a unit that presented well from the outside and was rotting from the inside. And they learned it so completely that many of them had stopped being able to tell the difference between what they showed and what was real. Ryan Foster was one of the ones who still knew. "I watched someone get transferred last month," he said. Corporal Diana Reyes. She filed a formal harassment complaint against one of the senior NCOs. Within 3 weeks, she was at 29 Palms. He paused. She didn't want to go to 29 Palms. Her husband is stationed here. Her kids are in school here. She gave up the complaint. It didn't matter. She was gone anyway. Olivia wrote down the name. "Anyone else?" Ryan looked at his hands. "There's a list," he said quietly. I don't have it written down, but I could tell you. Names, dates, what they reported, where they went." He looked up. "I've been keeping track in my head, Because I was afraid that writing it down would make it real. And if it was real, I'd have to do something about it. And I didn't know what to do. You're doing something about it now, Olivia said. I should have done it sooner. Yes, she said without cruelty. But you're here now and that matters. It matters a great deal. She looked at him steadily. I need you to tell me everything you remember. In order. Names, dates, whatever details you have, I need all of it. Ryan Foster nodded. He talked for another hour. The picture that emerged was precise and terrible, and exactly the kind of thing that Olivia Hayes had been trained to recognize, had been specifically sent here to find, and had hoped she would not find in as complete a form as she was now looking at. Because this wasn't a problem that could be fixed with a memo. This was a problem that required surgery, and surgery, she knew from experience, was always messier than anyone expected. She dismissed Ryan Foster at 11:45, with instructions to speak to no one about their conversation. And the moment the door closed, she was on a secure line to Joint Operations Command. The call lasted 12 minutes. When she hung up, she sat very still for a moment, and then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Because the thing about this kind of work, the thing that people who hadn't done it didn't understand, was that the moment you found what you were looking for was not the moment you stopped. It was the moment the real work began. And the real work in this case was going to require more than documentation. It was going to require witnesses who were willing to stand up. The question was whether they existed. The answer arrived at 1300 in the form of a knock on the documentation office door. Olivia looked up. The woman in the doorway was small, precise, with the kind of face that didn't give things away easily, not because nothing was happening behind it, but because she had learned, probably a long time ago, that showing things away freely was a luxury she couldn't afford. She was a corporal. Her name tag read Vasquez. Commander Hayes, she said. Corporal Vasquez. A pause. You know who I am. I know who everyone is, Olivia said. Come in. Corporal Ines Vasquez had been at Camp Pendleton for 3 years. She had 2 commendations in her file and 1 note of concern from Lieutenant Colonel Harmon that described her, in the careful language of official documentation, as resistant to correction. Olivia had read that note. She had understood it immediately. In Harmon's lexicon, resistant to correction meant willing to push back. It meant not easily made afraid. It meant, in other words, exactly the kind of person Olivia needed. Vasquez sat down across from her without being asked, which Olivia noted approvingly. I heard what happened yesterday, Vasquez said, with Sergeant Collins. Most people on this base heard. I'm not here about Collins. Vasquez looked at her directly. I'm here because I have a theory about why you're here, and if my theory is right, there are things you need to know that aren't in any file. Olivia set down her pen. Tell me your theory, Vasquez told her. Her theory was correct in every particular. What followed was the most significant conversation Olivia had on the base, not because of what Vasquez knew, though what she knew was substantial and damning, but because of what Vasquez had done about what she knew. Vasquez had kept records, not just in her head like Ryan Foster. Actual records. Written, dated, stored in a way she described with the methodical care of someone who had understood for a long time that they might need them. She had documented dates, names, incidents. She had made copies of transfer orders she had no official reason to have. She had written contemporaneous accounts of conversations that had troubled her, sealed in an envelope she'd sent to her own home address so the postmark would establish the date. She had done, in other words, exactly what a lawyer would have told her to do, and she was a corporal, not a lawyer, and nobody had told her to do it. How long have you been building this? Olivia asked. 14 months, Vasquez said. Why? The question landed in the room and sat there. Vasquez looked at her steadily. Because Corporal Diana Reyes was my best friend, she said. And because what happened to her was wrong. And because I didn't have power or rank or any of the things that would make someone listen to me. She paused. So I decided to build something they couldn't ignore. Olivia was quiet for a moment. You built it well, she said. Something crossed Vasquez's face, not pride exactly, but the particular expression of someone who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told that the weight of it was real and mattered and had not been carried for nothing. "What happens now?" Vasquez said. "Now," Olivia said, "we make sure it counts." The afternoon moved with the particular speed of things that cannot be slowed. At 14:30, Olivia met with Marcus Reed for the second time, and this time she told him enough, not everything, but enough to explain what was happening and what she needed from him. Marcus listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions. The first was about the scope of the investigation. The second was about Diana Reyes. When Olivia told him what had happened to Reyes, something shifted in Marcus Reed's face that she had not seen there before. Not anger, she had seen anger from him. This was different. This was the expression of a man who had suspected something for a long time and had hoped he was wrong, and had just found out he wasn't. And the finding out was its own particular grief. "I liked Reyes," he said quietly. "She was one of the sharp ones." "She still is," Olivia said. "Reyes filed a formal complaint with JAG 4 months ago from 29 Palms. That complaint is what triggered this assessment." Marcus absorbed that. "She didn't stop." "She didn't stop," Olivia confirmed. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Keeping this unit together. Keeping people calm. And when the time comes, and it's going to come too soon, I need you to stand up in front of the people who trust you and tell them the truth." "What truth?" Olivia looked at him. "That what happened here was wrong. That it happened on watch, and that it ends now." Marcus nodded slowly. "I can do that." "I know you can," Olivia said. "That's why I'm asking." He left. She turned back to the files. At 1600, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Harmon walked into the documentation office without knocking. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that arranged itself naturally into authority, the kind of face that had probably been managing rooms since his 20s. He wore his rank the way some men wore expensive watches, not as a utility, but as a statement. He looked at Olivia Hayes across the table, with the expression of a man who had spent the last 24 hours being briefed on a situation he was still convinced he could manage. "Commander Hayes," he said. His voice was even, controlled, precisely calibrated. "I thought it was time we spoke directly." Olivia gestured to the chair across from her. "Please." He sat. He didn't pull the chair close, which told her something. He wanted distance he could call neutral, because to him distance meant control. He set his hands flat on the table, fingers spread. Another tell, establishing presence, grounding himself in space. "I understand you've been conducting an assessment," he said. "I have, and I understand there was an incident yesterday involving Sergeant Collins." "There was. I want you to know," he said, "that I've already addressed that situation. Collins has been counseled. His behavior was unacceptable, and I've made that clear to him." "That's good to hear," Olivia said. Harmon paused. He had expected more resistance, or more deference, and had prepared for both, and her simple, even response gave him no purchase. He recalibrated. "I also want to address any concerns you may have about this unit's operational climate." "What makes you think I have concerns about the operational climate?" Olivia asked. The pause was barely perceptible. "You've been here for 7 days. You've been tracking my movements. I've been made aware of your presence." "By whom?" Another pause. "That's not relevant." Olivia looked at him. "Colonel Harmon," she said, "I appreciate you coming in. I want to have this conversation with you. And I'll have it fully at the appropriate time and with the appropriate people present. What I'm not going to do is have a preliminary discussion about the findings of this assessment with someone who is a subject of this assessment." She paused to let that land. "I think you understand what I mean by that." The room went very still. Richard Harmon's face didn't change. That was what told her everything, the complete, practiced non-change of it. A man who was genuinely unconcerned would have reacted with confusion, maybe indignation. A man who understood exactly what she meant and had been hoping to head it off would do precisely what Harmon was doing now. hold perfectly still, and give her nothing. "I see," he said. "I think you do," Olivia said. He stood. He smoothed his uniform with the flat of his palm, a gesture that was half habit and half delay, while he decided what he was going to say. "Commander Hayes," he said finally, "I have built something here. I know that what we do here might look harsh from outside. I know that soft metrics feelings, comfort, morale surveys, I know those are what assessors often look for. But what I have built here is a unit that performs, that delivers, that meets standards consistently in environments where other units fail." His voice was very steady. "I hope that performance is part of your assessment." Olivia looked at him for a long moment. "Colonel," she said, "a unit that, because it's people afraid to fail, is not a performing unit. It's a unit that hasn't been tested by the thing that will eventually reveal what it's actually made of." She paused. "That test always comes, and units built on fear don't pass it." She met his gaze. "I've seen it before. I'll see it again. What I'm here to determine is whether it's too late for this one." Harmon looked at her. She couldn't read his face, and she didn't need to. He left without another word. The door closed. Olivia sat still for exactly 5 seconds. Then she picked up her pen and wrote, "He knows. Below that, he'll move tonight." She underlined the second line twice. Because she had been in this position before, the position of a subject who realized the walls were closing. And she knew what men like Harmon did when they realized they were running out of time. They didn't collapse. They didn't confess. They organized. They reached out. They made calls. They mobilized whatever they had built that they thought could protect them. And not overnight, not all at once, and they almost always made their biggest mistake in the 12 hours. Following the moment they understood they were caught. She needed to be ready. She was on a secure line to JAG, within 3 minutes of Harmon leaving the room, and the call she made was not a status update. It was a request for the acceleration of proceedings. The officer on the other end listened, asked 2 questions. Then said, "How soon do you need movement?" 48 hours, Olivia said. A pause. "Understood, you'll have it." She hung up. Outside the window, she could hear the bass resuming its rhythms, boots on pavement, the distant bark of commands, the mechanical sounds of vehicles and equipment. Life continuing at its pace, people going about their jobs. Most of them unaware of what was building beneath the surface of the ordinary day. Private Ethan Brooks jogged past on a training circuit, and for just a moment he glanced toward the documentation office window. He didn't slow down, but something in his face, even at a distance, was different from what it had been yesterday. More awake, maybe, more watchful. The ones who were paying attention always knew when something had shifted, even before they could name what it was. Olivia turned back to her files. What she found in them over the next 3 hours was methodical and quiet and devastating. Transfer orders that, taken individually, looked like routine force management, but, seen as a pattern, formed something unmistakable. Performance reviews that tracked perfectly with compliance. Soldiers who asked no questions were rated outstanding. Soldiers who raised issues found their evaluations suddenly noting attitude concerns and difficulty with direction. A set of dates that aligned with awful precision to a list of complaints that had never been formally received. The machine had been built carefully by someone who understood systems well enough to corrupt them while keeping them looking clean. But the problem with building a machine was that every machine left a record of its own construction. Every gear had to be turned by someone. Every cover story had to be told to someone. And somewhere in the architecture of it all, there were always people who had turned the gears and told the stories and carried the weight of it. And who were, by that 3rd or 4th year, very, very tired. Those were the people who opened doors when someone knocked. Ryan Foster had opened a door. Ines Vasquez had built a door of her own and been waiting 14 months for someone with the right key. And somewhere else on this base, Olivia could feel it with the certainty that came not from instinct, but from long experience. There was at least one more person carrying something they had needed to put down for longer than they could say. The knock came at 1900. She had expected it. What she had not expected was who was standing on the other side of the door. Master Sergeant James Calloway, the one who had noticed her yesterday near the motor pool, the one Marcus Reed had called one of the good ones, was standing in the hallway with a folder in his hand and an expression on his face that she recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who had made a decision that they had been building toward for a very long time and had finally, at this specific moment on this specific night, chosen to walk through. He held out the folder. Olivia took it. She opened it. She read the first page, then the second. On the third page, she stopped reading and looked up at him. "How long have you had this?" she said. 8 months, Calloway said. "I've been trying to figure out how to use it." He stopped. "Without it being the end of everything. And now?" He looked at her steadily. "I think the end of everything might be exactly what this needs." Olivia looked back down at the folder. What it contained was the final piece, the piece she hadn't known existed. The piece that transformed everything from a pattern of concerning behavior into something that the entire chain of command above Camp Pendleton would be unable to look away from. It was the piece that changed the shape of the next 48 hours completely. She closed the folder. She looked at Calloway. "You did the right thing," she said. Calloway nodded once. He didn't look relieved exactly. He looked like a man who had set down something very heavy and was only now beginning to understand how much of his spine had bent under it. He left. Olivia sat alone in the documentation office with the folder on the table in front of her and the sounds of Camp Pendleton moving through the night outside. And she understood that what had begun as an assessment of a training unit's culture had become something that was going to be felt far beyond this base. She thought about Corporal Diana Reyes at Twentyne Palms, 600 miles away, who had started this entire chain of events by refusing to stop. She thought about Ethan Brooks, jogging in the dark, asking himself the right questions. She thought about Marcus Reed, walking back to his quarters with the weight of 24 years, and the particular burden of a good man in a broken place who had held on long enough for someone to show up and make it count. She picked up her secure phone and made one final call. "General Walker," she said, "you need to be here tomorrow." General Nathan Walker arrived at Camp Pendleton at 547 the following morning, 40 minutes before the base officially woke up, in an unmarked vehicle with no escort and no announcement. That alone told everyone who saw it that something was different. Generals did not arrive without ceremony. They did not pull up in plain vehicles before sunrise. They did not walk into a base as though they were trying not to be seen. The two MPs at the main gate processed his credentials in silence and exchanged a look after the vehicle passed that communicated, without a single word, that neither of them had any idea what was happening, and both of them understood instinctively that asking would be the wrong move. Word reached Marcus Reed at 552. He was already awake. He had not slept well. The folder that Calloway had described to him, he didn't know the contents, only that Calloway had handed it over, only that whatever was inside it had changed the weight of the air on this base. Overnight, like sat and somewhere in his mind, like a stone he couldn't stop turning over. He had spent the dark hours of the morning in the particular way of men, who have done everything they can do and are now waiting for the world to catch up to the shape of what they know. When his phone buzzed with the message about Walker, he was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. He found Olivia Hayes already in the command conference room, the folder open on the table in front of her. A second chair pulled close, not across the table, but beside her, at an angle that said this was a working meeting, not a confrontation. General Walker was standing at the window, with his back to the room, hands clasped behind him, reading something on a single sheet of paper that Olivia had handed him the moment he walked in. Marcus knocked on the open door. Walker turned. "Reed, come in. Close the door." Marcus came in. He closed the door. Walker looked at him for a moment with the assessing gaze of a man who had long ago trained himself to read people quickly and had found the exercise reliable. Whatever he saw in Marcus Reed seemed to satisfy something, because he nodded once and gestured to the chair across from Olivia. "Sit down, Gunnery Sergeant. You're going to want to be sitting for this." Marcus sat. What followed was 40 minutes of the most precise, controlled, damning presentation Marcus Reed had ever witnessed. Olivia spoke without notes, working from memory and from the folder, and from 7 days of observation and documentation. And she laid out what she had found with the kind of clinical clarity that made everything worse by making everything undeniable. It was one thing to suspect a system was broken. It was another thing entirely to watch someone disassemble it piece by piece on a table in front of you and show you exactly how the pieces fit together and exactly where each break had been made. The transfers, the disappeared complaints, the performance reviews weaponized as compliance tools, the specific, deliberate, carefully constructed apparatus of a command climate that had taken 18 months to build and had been running for the past year with the smooth efficiency of something that believed it would never be examined. Walker listened without speaking. His face did not change in ways that were readable. He was too experienced for that. But his hands which had remained still through most of the presentation, moved twice. Once when Olivia named the number of documented transfers that correlated with complaint filings. And once when she opened to the last section of the folder, Calloway's section, and slid 3 pages across the table toward him. He read those pages. He set them face down on the table. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How did Calloway get this?" "He was present at a meeting 14 months ago," Olivia said. The meeting was not officially documented. Calloway understood what he was hearing and made his own record. She paused. "He kept it because he didn't know what to do with it. He gave it to me because he decided that not using it was no longer something he could live with." "Does Harmon know Calloway has it?" "Not yet." Walker looked at her. "But he knows you're close. He came to see me yesterday afternoon. He was careful, but yes, he knows the assessment has moved beyond what he was expecting." "What is he doing making calls?" Olivia said. "I don't know to whom yet. But by tonight I will." Walker stood. He walked to the window again, and Marcus watched him standing there with the weight of what was on that table behind him, and understood something about what it meant to hold rank that he hadn't fully understood before. The weight didn't get lighter the higher you went. It got heavier because the higher you went, the more of it belonged to you. Walker had known about problems at this base, at some level had to have. Because Reyes's complaint had come through JAG, and JAG reported upward, but knowing about a problem and seeing its full architecture laid out in a classified folder were 2 different things. One allowed for optimism, the other did not. Walker turned back to the room. "I want Harmon in this building by 1000, he said. Olivia nodded. "He'll know what it means." "Yes," Walker said. "He will." His voice carried the particular flatness of a general who had stopped being angry and moved into something colder and more useful. "That's the point." He looked at Marcus. "Gunnery Sergeant Reed. You've been in this unit for how long?" 3 years, sir." "And in that time, how many complaints did you personally witness being filed?" Marcus considered. 7 that I know of, directly. Probably more that I didn't. How many resulted in formal proceedings?" "None, sir." Walker held his gaze. "And you continued to serve in this unit." It wasn't an accusation. It was a question that had an accusation inside it, which was more honest. Marcus met it directly, the way he met most things. "Yes, sir. Because I believed I told myself that staying was more useful than leaving. That if I stayed, I could protect some of the people that would have been left with nobody." He paused. "I'm no longer certain that was the right call. But it was the call I made, and I made it every day." Walker was quiet. "It was a hard call," he said finally. "And I think you made it for the right reasons." He paused. "That doesn't mean it was right, but I understand it." Marcus nodded once. "I need you to understand something," Walker said. "What happens today, and it's going to be a significant day, is going to ask a great deal of the people in this unit. It's going to ask them to adjust everything they thought they knew about this command structure. Very quickly, in a very public way. That kind of adjustment breaks units that aren't held together by something real. He looked at Marcus steadily. I need to know that this unit is held together by something real. Marcus looked at him. He thought about the east fence line that morning. He thought about Ryan Foster in the documentation office. He thought about Ines Vasquez, who had spent 14 months building something in secret because she believed it would matter someday. He thought about Ethan Brooks, jogging in the dark, asking himself the right questions. Yes, sir, he said. It is. Walker nodded. The decision was made. At 900, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Harmon received a formal written notification to report to the command conference room at 1000 for what the notifications described, in the bureaucratic language of military documentation, as a command climate review. He read it twice. Then he sat very still at his desk for approximately 90 seconds. Then he picked up his phone. The call he made lasted 6 minutes. The person he called, his name would not emerge for another 2 weeks, was someone several steps up the chain who had, at various points over the past 18 months, received briefings on this unit's performance metrics without receiving the full picture of what those metrics were built on. Harmon had been careful about that. The briefings had been accurate in what they included. They had been strategic in what they omitted. Now Harmon was calling in a debt that he had not fully articulated until this moment, the debt of shared reputation. The debt of a superior who had praised this unit's numbers in presentations to people who mattered, who had a stake in those numbers being what they appeared to be. The person on the other end of the call was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Richard, I can't help you with this." "I'm not asking for help," Harmon said carefully. "I'm giving you information that may be relevant to. I heard what you said, and I'm telling you clearly that I cannot be involved in this. Whatever you're facing, you face it through appropriate channels." The line went dead. Harmon sat with the phone in his hand. This was the moment, the one Olivia had predicted the night before. The one she had written about in her notebook with 2 underlines. This was the moment when the machine a man had built revealed whether it had been built on something real or on the temporary compliance of people who had always intended to walk away when the cost got too high. The cost was too high, and Harmon was alone. He set his phone down. He straightened his uniform. He walked at the command conference room and knocked at exactly 1000. The door opened. Harmon walked in and saw 4 people: General Walker, Commander Hayes, a JAG officer he didn't recognize, and Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Reed. He registered each of them in sequence, and what moved through his face as he processed the room was something that the people watching later described differently. Walker called it resignation. Olivia called it recalibration. Marcus Reed, when he was asked, said simply, he finally saw it all at once. "Colonel Harmon," Walker said. "Sit down." Harmon sat. What followed was not a confrontation in the way movies construct confrontations. There was no raised voice. There was no dramatic revelation. There was, instead, something far more devastating: the precise, systematic presentation of evidence by people who had done this before and understood that the truth was most powerful when it was delivered without theater. The JAG officer, whose name was Captain Reena Patel, presented the formal findings. She spoke for 22 minutes. She covered dates, documentation, names, and the specific regulatory violations that had been identified. She presented the Reyes complaint and the chain of transfers that had followed it. She presented Calloway's document, which Harmon recognized the moment it appeared, and whose appearance did to his face what no amount of verbal accusation had managed. When Patel finished, Walker looked at Harmon and said, "Do you want to respond?" Harmon was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the silence took on its own shape in the room. "I want to say," he said finally, "that everything I did because I believed it was in the best interest of this unit's performance." "I understand that," Walker said. "I believed that strength, clear, consistent, demanding." "Colonel." Walker's voice was not unkind. That was the remarkable thing about it. It was not unkind, and it was completely immovable. I'm not here to debate your philosophy. I'm here because people under your command were systematically silenced when they tried to use the systems that exist to protect them. I'm here because a corporal named Diana Reyes was sent 600 miles from her family because she tried to report something she had a legal right to report. He paused. I'm here because it took a covert assessment to surface information that should have been visible to this command months ago. Another pause. The question of your intentions doesn't change the reality of what was built here. Harmon looked at the table. No, he said, I suppose it doesn't. At that moment, outside the command building, something else was happening. The base had not been informed of what was taking place in the conference room. That was intentional. But bases have their own nervous system, their own capacity for reading environmental signals that are too subtle for individual description but are collectively, immediately understood. People had sensed the shift, the arrival before sunrise, the unusual vehicles near command, the absence of certain officers from their usual positions, the particular quality of the morning that felt like the held breath before a decision. By 1030, the training field was operating at full capacity, because that was what you did when you didn't know what was happening. You did your job, precisely and completely, and you waited. But the conversations in the pauses between drills were different. Shorter, more careful, more aware. Ethan Brooks was running a drill circuit when Ryan Foster fell into step beside him. Something's happening at command, Ryan said low. I know, Ethan said. You know what it is? Ethan thought about the documentation office. About the window he'd passed every day for 7 days, and the woman inside it, who had been building something he couldn't see, but could feel the shape of. Not exactly, he said, but I think it's going to be okay. Ryan looked at him. That's a very specific kind of okay. I know, they ran in silence for a moment. She's good, Ryan said. Not a question, yeah, Ethan said. She really is. Inside the command building, the meeting with Harmon had concluded, and the JAG officer was preparing the formal documentation for what would become a multi-week proceedings process. Walker had stepped into the hallway, and Olivia had followed, and they stood together for a moment, in the particular quiet that follows a room where something significant has just ended. How many of these have you done? Walker asked. This is my 8th ISA, she said. And how often does it go this far? Olivia considered. 3 times out of 8. This is the most complex structure I've encountered. She paused. It's also the one with the most people who were paying attention in the right ways, even without knowing what to do with what they saw. Walker looked at her. Reed Foster Vasquez, Calloway. And Brooks, she said. He's new, but he's going to be worth watching. Walker nodded slowly. What does this unit need right now? It needs to be told the truth, Olivia said, today. Not a sanitized version, not a message from command that frames this in the most comfortable possible way. The people in this unit have been living inside a lie for 18 months. The most destabilizing thing you can do to them now is offer them another comfortable narrative. She met his gaze. They need to hear someone they trust tell them what actually happened, and that it is over. Walker looked at her for a long moment. Marcus Reed, he said. Yes, Olivia said, Marcus Reed. At 1400, Walker called a formation. Every person on the base, no exceptions. The training field held nearly 600 people by the time the assembly was complete. And silence that fell when General Walker walked out was the full absolute silence of a place that had been waiting for something it couldn't name. Walker stood at the front of the formation. He did not use notes. 3 days ago, he said, a commander from Joint Operations Command completed a 7-day assessment of this unit. I'm going to tell you what she found. He paused. I'm going to tell you all of it. 600 people stood very still, Walker told them. Not all of it. There were ongoing proceedings that required certain discretions, but enough. He told them about the complaint mechanism failures. He told them about the transfers. He told them, without naming her directly, about a corporal who had refused to stop pushing even when the system tried to make her stop. He told them that what had been built here, in the name of high standards and unit performance, had crossed a line that the military existed to prevent from being crossed. He told them it was over. When he finished, the silence held for another 3 seconds. Then Marcus Reed stepped forward. Walker looked at him and gave the smallest nod. Marcus turned to face the formation. He had been a gunnery sergeant for 9 years, and he had stood in front of units in a lot of configurations. And he had always known the difference between speaking to people and speaking at them. He had always known, without having to think about it, what each moment required. This moment required everything he had. "I've been here 3 years," Marcus said. His voice carried across the field without effort, the way voices do when they have nothing to hide behind. "I saw things in those 3 years that I reported through channels, and when those channels didn't work, I stayed anyway. I told myself that staying was protecting people." He paused. "I still believe that. But I also know that staying without fighting harder, without finding a different way to push, meant that some of you carried something you shouldn't have had to carry alone." He looked across the formation. "For that I owe you an apology, not as your gunnery sergeant. As someone who was here and chose continuity when maybe what was needed was noise." The field was utterly still. "What happened here was not your fault," Marcus said. "And it was not a reflection of this branch, or this base, or the people who serve here. It was a reflection of one man's choices and the system that allowed those choices to continue too long." He paused. "But it's done now, and what we build from here is our choice. Every single one of us." Ethan Brooks, standing in the 3rd row, felt something move through him that he couldn't name. It wasn't relief exactly, though relief was part of it. It was something closer to recognition, the feeling of seeing something that had been abstract become real. He had grown up hearing words like integrity and accountability in classrooms and during training, and had believed in them in the abstract, careful way you believe in things you haven't tested yet. What he was watching Marcus Reed do was not abstract. It was the specific, costly, unglamorous thing itself. Standing up in front of 600 people and saying, "I could have done better," without any performance in it. He understood, watching Marcus, that he was looking at what a leader actually was. Not the uniform, not the rank, not the capacity to make people afraid. The willingness to be accountable in front of the people who needed to see it. He made a decision, standing in that formation, that would shape the next decade of his career. He couldn't have articulated it precisely. It didn't have clear language yet. It was more instinct than plan, but the decision was real, and it was made, and it held. After the formation was dismissed, people stood in small groups across the field in the uncertain way of people whose landscape has shifted and are recalibrating their footing. Some conversations were quiet, some were emotional. Olivia watched from a distance, notebook closed for the first time in days. Ines Vasquez found her at the edge of the field. "Was that what you expected?" Vasquez asked. "More or less," Olivia said, "the part where Reed apologized." You didn't tell him to do that, did you?" "No," Olivia said, "that was his." Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. "It needed to be." They stood together watching the field clear. "What happens to Harmon?" Vasquez asked. "Formal proceedings." "JAG. It takes time, but it moves." Olivia paused. "What happened to Reyes takes longer to fix than what happened to Harmon." "But both of those things are in motion now." Vasquez nodded slowly. "She doesn't know yet, Reyes. She will by tonight," Olivia said. "I'm making that call myself." Something moved through Vasquez's face, something compressed and private that had been under pressure for a long time. She nodded once, very slightly, and then she straightened, and she walked back toward the field, and Olivia watched her go and thought, 14 months. This woman spent 14 months building something in a folder she sent to her own address, in a unit that had taught its people that speaking was punished, because she believed that one day someone would come who could use it. That was not weakness, that was not helplessness, that was the most disciplined, patient, tenacious form of resistance available to someone without power, deployed with absolute precision at the exact moment it mattered. Olivia Hayes had been doing this work for 9 years, and she had never stopped being moved by it. By the specific, stubborn human capacity for refusing to let the wrong thing be permanent. By the Vasquezes and Reeds and Brookses who absorbed the pressure of broken systems without being broken themselves, who held on until holding on produced something, who chose to believe that the truth was worth carrying, even when they had to carry it alone. She picked up her notebook, she opened it to a fresh page. And she wrote the one thing she always wrote. On the day the turning point arrived, the sentence that reminded her why she did this. On the days when the work was heavy, and the systems moved slowly, and the cost of it showed, on the faces of people who had deserved better than what they got. She wrote, "The truth moves. It just needs a door." Today there had been several. Tomorrow, the real work of rebuilding would begin. But tonight, somewhere in Twentinine Palms, a phone was going to ring. And on the other end of it, a corporal named Diana Reyes, who had filed a complaint when the system told her not to, who had been transferred and separated from her family, and told, in the language of bureaucratic consequence, that speaking cost more than it was worth. That corporal was going to pick up the phone. And the first thing Olivia Hayes was going to say to her was, "You were right. It worked. Come home." The field was clearing. The day was moving toward evening. Camp Pendleton, which had been holding its breath for 3 years, without knowing it, was beginning, slowly, haltingly, in the imperfect way that real things begin, to breathe. The call to Diana Reyes lasted 47 minutes. Olivia had expected it to be shorter. She had made calls like this before, the call that told someone the thing they had been waiting to hear, the call that closed a chapter that had been left open too long at terrible cost. She knew the shape of those calls. They were usually brief, because the person on the other end was too overwhelmed to talk for long, and because there was only so much that words could carry when what was needed was time and proximity and the kind of comfort that a phone line couldn't provide. But Diana Reyes was not overwhelmed. She was precise. She asked questions, specific, intelligent, procedural questions about what had been found and what the findings meant and what the timeline would look like for the formal proceedings. She asked about her transfer orders and whether they would be reviewed. She asked about the other people who had been moved. She asked, with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to manage their own hope very precisely, whether there was any possibility of being reassigned back to Pendleton before the end of the fiscal year. Olivia answered every question directly. She did not soften things. She did not manage Reyes' expectations downward the way people sometimes managed expectations when they were afraid of disappointing someone they had just given hope to. She told her the truth about what was likely, what was possible, and what was uncertain, and she told her in the voice of someone who believed Diana Reyes had earned the right to the full, unvarnished version. Near the end of the call, there was a pause. Then Reyes said quietly, "I used to think that maybe I was wrong. Not about what happened, I knew what happened, but about whether it was worth it. Whether reporting it was worth what it cost. And now?" Olivia said. Another pause, longer. "Ask me again in 6 months," Reyes said. "When I know how it ends." "Fair enough," Olivia said. Commander Hayes. Reyes's voice had something in it that was difficult to name. Not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was there. Something older than gratitude. Something that sounded like recognition between two people who had been in the same kind of fight by different means. "Thank you for coming in. Thank you for not stopping," Olivia said. "You're the reason anyone came." The line was quiet for a moment. Then Reyes said, "Tell Vasquez, tell her I got it. She'll know what that means." The call ended. Olivia sat in the empty documentation office and looked at the wall for 30 seconds, which was about as long as she ever allowed herself to sit and feel the weight of a day like this one. Then she stood. She closed the folder on the table. She picked up her notebook, which was nearly full, now barely 10 blank pages left, and she walked out of the documentation office for the last time. She had work to do. The formal report would take 3 days to complete. It was the part of this job that nobody romanticized and nobody should, because it was meticulous and exhausting and required the particular discipline of translating everything you had seen and heard and understood into language, precise enough to withstand legal scrutiny, while still being true to what had actually happened. Olivia was good at it. She was good at it, the way surgeons were good at paperwork, not because it was the part they lived for, but because they understood that the documentation was the thing that made the surgery permanent. Without it, people healed, and then broke the same way again. With it, the break became a record, and the record became the thing that prevented repetition. She worked until 2 in the morning. She was back at it by 5:30. What she did not know, what nobody told her, until the second day of report writing. When Marcus Reed knocked on the door of the temporary office she'd been assigned, and sat down across from her with the look of a man carrying information he wasn't sure how to deliver, was that Richard Harmon had not spent the night quietly, accepting the consequences of the meeting with Walker and Jag. He had spent the night making calls, not to his superior, who had declined to be involved, to his contemporaries, to the network of professional relationships that a man with 22 years of service accumulates, some genuine, some transactional, many complicated. He had reached 3 people who were willing to listen. Of those 3, 2 had offered sympathy and done nothing. The third had said something that mattered. The third was Colonel David Merritt, currently stationed at the Pentagon, currently with access to a specific communications channel that was above Marcus Reed's pay grade to know about and above Harmon's authority to be using for this purpose. Merritt had not offered to intervene directly. What he had offered was subtler and, in the way of subtle things, more dangerous. He had suggested that Harmon's formal response to the ICA findings include a counter-narrative. Not a denial, not an argument against the facts, because the facts were too well documented to argue against. Something more sophisticated, a reframing, a presentation of context that shifted the upward and outward, that argued the culture at Camp Pendleton was systemic rather than personal, that pointed to policies and pressures from above that had incentivized exactly the kind of performance at all costs environment Harmon had built, and that suggested, carefully, with supporting data, that Harmon had been as much a product of those incentives as he had been their author. It was a smart strategy. Olivia recognized it immediately when Marcus described it, because she had seen versions of it before and she knew exactly how much damage it could do to a set of proceedings if it was well constructed and delivered by someone with the right access. "How did you find this out?" she asked. Marcus looked at her steadily. "One of the 3 people he called is someone I trust," he said. "That person called me at midnight." Olivia absorbed that. "Who else knows? You and me. Keep it that way for now." She was already thinking, already moving through the implications. Harmon has the right to construct a defense. He has the right to present context. That's the process, and we don't want to interfere with the process, because the process is the only thing that makes the outcome legitimate. She paused. "What I need to know is whether Merritt has the standing and the access to move this to a different venue before the current proceedings are fully established." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I don't have access to that level." "I do," Olivia said. She reached for her phone. "Give me an hour." The call she made was not to General Walker. Walker was the right person for many things, but this particular call required someone whose authority sat at a different angle to the situation, someone who could verify, quickly and discreetly, whether a specific channel was being accessed, and by whom and to what purpose, without triggering the kind of institutional alarm that would slow everything down. She made the call. She explained what she needed. The person on the other end said they would have information by 1400. At 1350, her phone rang. The information was both better and worse than she had hoped. Better because Merritt had not yet transmitted anything formal. He had made inquiries, but nothing had moved on paper. Worse, because the channel he had access to was one where informal inquiries sometimes produced formal outcomes, before anyone outside the channel realized it was happening. The window was narrow. She had perhaps 18 hours before the landscape of the proceedings changed. She called Walker. He answered on the second ring. She laid it out in 4 minutes flat. Walker was quiet for exactly 10 seconds. Then he said, "Who's your contact at JAG, Patel?" "Get Patel on a three-way call in 10 minutes. I'll have my aide set it up." The three-way call lasted 25 minutes and resulted in a single decision: accelerate the formal filing to that afternoon. Not ideal, the report wasn't finished, but a partial filing with the full documentation already in hand was legally sufficient to establish the proceedings under the existing jurisdiction, which would foreclose the possibility of Merritt's channel producing a venue change before the case was anchored. Olivia spent the next 4 hours completing the sections of the report she needed most urgently, in the order they were needed, which was not the order she had originally planned to write them in. She was used to this the way investigations had their own momentum, their own demands, their own sudden requirements that reset your planning in real time. You could not be rigid in this work. The work itself would not permit it. At 1700, Captain Reena Patel filed. At 1740, a message came through that told Olivia the window had closed. Merritt's inquiry had gone quiet. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Then she went back to writing. It was Marcus Reed, who noticed on the morning of the third day that something was happening with Derek Collins that wasn't covered by anyone's plans. Collins had returned to duty. He had been doing his job with the kind of quiet, heads-down precision of someone who understood that performing his function correctly was the only contribution currently available to him, and he had done it without complaint, without confrontation, without any of the ambient aggression that had characterized his pre-assessment behavior. Marcus had been watching him with the attention of someone responsible for him, which Marcus understood to mean responsible for who he was becoming, not just what he was doing. What Marcus noticed on the third morning was that Collins had arrived early to brief 3 junior Marines on a security protocol, and that the briefing was different. Not in content, the content was the same procedure they'd been using for months. Different in tone, different in the specific calibration of how he delivered information, which was no longer the performative authority who needed people to be impressed, and was instead something quieter and more functional. He showed them the procedure. He asked if they had questions. When one of them asked something he'd have dismissed 6 days ago, he answered it. Marcus stood at the edge of the area and watched for 4 minutes. Then he walked away. He found Olivia in the hallway near the temporary office. "Collins is changing," he said. Olivia looked at him. "I know. What do you think happens to him, formally?" Olivia considered. The physical contact was a single incident. He was wrong, and it's documented, and there will be formal consequences. But the investigation isn't about Collins. He was a symptom. That doesn't excuse it. It means the weight of what's built here doesn't all land on him. She paused. What happens to him is partly a function of what he does next. That's a heavy thing to put on someone who might not understand they're being watched. Everybody's being watched, Olivia said. The question is whether they're doing the right thing because they know they're being watched or because they've decided it's who they want to be. She paused. 3 days in, I can't tell you which one it is for Collins. But I can tell you that Marcus Reed took time he didn't have to sit on the ground next to a man who made a mistake, and that matters. Marcus looked at her. You saw that east fence. 0800. She held his gaze. I see everything, Gunnery Sergeant. That's my job. Marcus was quiet for a moment. What's in your report about me? The question came out very directly, the way Marcus did most things. Olivia appreciated that. She had been waiting for him to ask it, and she had been thinking about how to answer it in the way that was both truthful and complete. You're in the report as a stabilizing presence in a fractured unit, she said. Your prior complaints through channels are documented as evidence that the complaint suppression system was active and functional, meaning Your reports went in and disappeared, which tells us something important about how the machine worked. Your cooperation with this assessment is documented. Your statement at the formation is documented." She paused. "What's also documented is that you stayed in a unit with a culture you knew was wrong for 3 years without finding a way to escalate beyond the channels that were already compromised." Marcus held her gaze. "Is that a finding of fault?" "It's a finding of fact," Olivia said carefully. "What it means in terms of consequence depends on context and process. My read, and this is mine, not the official finding, is that you made a hard call in an impossible position, and you made it out of genuine concern for the people under you. That matters. It doesn't erase the limitation, but it matters." She paused. "You know as well as I do that the military doesn't grade on how hard the position was. It grades on whether the decision was correct." Marcus nodded. Slow, deliberate, the nod of a man accepting something he had been expecting to hear and had been prepared for. "I know," he said. "I've known that since day one." "Then you've been living with that," Olivia said, "and you kept doing the right thing as best you could while living with it. That's not nothing." She held his gaze. "For whatever it's worth, and I know the process doesn't run on what's worth saying, you're one of the reasons this unit has people in it worth saving." Marcus was quiet. "Thank you," he said. The 2 words were very simple and very sincere. "Don't thank me," Olivia said. "Thank Reyes. She's the one who started this." The 3rd twist came at noon on the 4th day, and it came from a direction nobody had anticipated. A lieutenant junior officer, 26 years old, stationed at Pendleton for 8 months, walked into the temporary JAG office that had been established on base for the duration of the proceedings, and asked to speak to Captain Patel. When Patel came out, the lieutenant, whose name was Claire Nakamura, handed her a tablet. On the tablet was a video. Patel watched it for 40 seconds. Then she said, "Wait here," and she went to find Olivia. The video was 8 minutes long. It had been recorded by Nakamura on her personal device 11 months ago, in what appeared to be a corridor near one of the unit offices, and it captured a conversation between Lieutenant Colonel Harmon and a staff sergeant, whose transfer orders had been cut 2 days later. The conversation was explicit in ways that the documented record had only implied. Harmon's voice was clear, his words were precise, the meaning was unmistakable. Nakamura had kept it for 11 months because she had been 25 years old and 3 months into her first posting, and she had not known what to do with what she had recorded, and by the time she had understood what she had and what it meant, she had been too afraid of what using it would cost her. She had watched the formation 3 days ago. She had watched Marcus Reed stand in front of 600 people and say the things he had said. She had gone back to her quarters and sat on her bunk for 3 days, running the same calculation over and over, until the numbers came out the same way they kept coming out. She had decided that 11 months was long enough to be afraid. Olivia watched the video twice. She looked at Nakamura, who was sitting in Patel's chair with the careful, controlled posture of someone waiting to be told whether they had done the right thing or made the worst mistake of their career. "Lieutenant Nakamura," Olivia said, "how old are you?" 26, ma'am." "How long did you sit with this before coming in?" 11 months, 2 weeks and 4 days. The precision of it was gutting. The way she had counted, the way she knew exactly, to the day, how long she had carried it. "Why today?" Olivia asked. "What made today different from any other day?" Nakamura looked at her. Gunnery Sergeant Reed said that staying without fighting harder meant that some of the people under him carried something they shouldn't have had to carry alone. She paused. "I thought I've been making other people carry this alone by staying quiet. Because I was scared." Another pause. "I'm still scared. But I decided that scared and right was better than safe and wrong." Olivia looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "It is." What Nakamura's video did to the proceedings was significant in the way that a single clear piece of evidence can be significant, not because the other evidence was insufficient. It wasn't. The case was already well constructed, but because it removed the last viable space in which a counter-narrative could operate. The reframing strategy that Harmon had been building with Merritt's guidance, required ambiguity. It required the argument that high standards had been misinterpreted, that transfers had been routine, that the culture had been demanding but not deliberately punitive. With Nakamura's video in evidence, that argument collapsed. Because the video didn't leave room for interpretation. What it showed was not a man with a demanding management philosophy. It showed a man who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. Patel called Walker at 13:30. Walker's response was 4 words. File everything by tonight. By 2000, the filing was complete. By 2100, the base knew in the imprecise, rapid, word-of-mouth way basis, knew things that something significant had changed in the legal landscape of what was happening. Ethan Brooks heard it from Ryan Foster, who had heard it from someone in the JAG temporary office, who had not said specifics, but whose face had said enough. It's done, Ryan said. I mean, the process keeps going. But it's done. Ethan stood with that for a moment. Nakamura, he said. He had seen her going into the JAG office that morning. He hadn't known why. He knew now. Ryan looked at him. How did you? I didn't know, Ethan said. I've been watching people choose. All week, and she had the look of someone who had made one. Ryan shook his head slowly. You're going to be either very good at this or completely insufferable. Hopefully both, Ethan said. They stood quietly for a moment. What happens to Reyes? Ethan asked. She gets to come back, Ryan said. Eventually, the transfer gets reviewed. Everything gets reviewed. He paused. It's not fast. Yeah, Ryan said. It happens. Ethan thought about a woman he had never met, 600 miles away, who had filed a complaint and lost her posting and her proximity to her family, and had kept pushing anyway until someone with enough authority came through a door and found the door Ines Vasquez had built and picked up the folder Calloway had carried for 8 months and watched a video Nakamura had held for almost a year. He thought about the chain of it, the way each person who had chosen to hold on had made the next person's choice possible. The way courage was not one dramatic moment, but dozens of small decisions made by people who were scared and chose right anyway. Ryan, he said. Yeah, when this is over, when everything is processed and the paperwork is done and the new command structure is in place, is anybody going to remember this right, the way it actually happened? Ryan thought about it. Some people will. We should make sure we do, Ethan said. All of us who were here. We should make sure we remember it accurately. Because the temptation is going to be to make it simpler. To make it about the big moment, the formation, the Commander Walker showing up. And it wasn't that. It Reyes, Ryan said, and Vasquez. And Calloway and Nakamura and Reed and you, Ryan said. Paying attention. Ethan shook his head. I didn't do anything. You're going to, Ryan said. That's what I've decided to believe. Olivia Hayes finished her formal report on the afternoon of the 5th day. It was 214 pages. It covered the full scope of what had been found, the complaint suppression mechanism, the transfer patterns, the performance review weaponization, the specific incidents and their documentation, the timeline of events from Harmon's arrival through the present, the roster of witnesses who had provided testimony or evidence, the formal findings, and the recommended actions. It was meticulous and complete and written in the language of institutional accountability that did not forgive and did not editorialize and did not need to, because the facts were sufficiently devastating without any help from sentiment. She printed it. She signed every page. She transmitted the digital copy to Walker, to JEG, to Joint Operations Command, and to the Office of the Inspector General. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for exactly 1 minute. Then she stood. There was one thing left to do on this base before she left. One conversation she had been postponing, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she wanted to say it at the right moment, and the right moment required the report to be done. She found Derek Collins at the East Security Checkpoint at 1700. Same location, different day. He was running the checkpoint with 2 junior Marines, running it with the quiet, functional competence that Marcus had noticed that morning. When he saw Olivia approaching, something moved through his face, not fear, Something more complicated than fear. Something that had guilt and recognition and a question in it that he hadn't yet found the language to ask. "Sergeant Collins," she said. "Commander Hayes." He turned to the two junior Marines. "Take your positions." They moved. He turned back to her. They stood facing each other at the checkpoint, where 6 days ago he had grabbed her wrist and she had warned him, and the world had shifted. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice was direct. "No performance in it." "You do," Olivia said. "I put my hands on a superior officer who was conducting an authorized operation. I escalated a situation that I should have de-escalated. I let my ego make my decisions." He paused. "That's not who I intend to be." "I know," Olivia said. He looked at her. "How?" "Because the man I watched this morning briefing those 3 Marines, he was asking questions instead of just giving orders." "That's a change, Collins." "Small one, but real." She paused. "Real is what matters, not size." Collins was quiet for a moment. "What happens to me? In the formal process, there will be documentation. A formal reprimand. The physical contact with an officer is not something the process can overlook." She met his gaze. "What happens after that depends on you, specifically on whether the change I watched this morning is a performance or the beginning of something genuine." "How will you know?" "I won't," she said. "That's not my job after today. My job was to find what was broken and report it and set the repair in motion. Your job, what you do with who you're becoming, that's not mine." "That's yours." She held his gaze. "I hope you make good use of it, Sergeant." "I genuinely do." Collins nodded. It was a slow nod, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than the surface. "The woman I grabbed," he said. "I didn't know who she was. But even if I had stopped, that's the part I keep coming back to. Even if I'd known she was nobody, even if she really had been a civilian contractor with no rank and no authority, it still would have been wrong." He paused. "That's the thing I couldn't see before. It was always wrong. Rank didn't make it wrong. The rank just made it visible." Olivia looked at him for a moment. "Keep that thought, Sergeant," she said. "Write it down if you need to, but keep it." She walked away from the checkpoint. Behind her, Derek Collins turned back to the east perimeter, and his shoulders were different than they had been 6 days ago. Harder in a way that was not aggression, more settled. Like someone who had found the bottom of something and pushed off it, and was now headed, slowly and without grace, but with genuine intention, toward the surface. The evening was coming in. Somewhere across the base, a phone rang. Somewhere in 29 Palms, Corporal Diana Reyes was packing a box. Somewhere in a JAG office, 214 pages were being read for the first time. And Commander Olivia Hayes walked across Camp Pendleton in the early evening with her notebook under her arm, and the knowledge that the thing she had come here to do was done, and that the thing she had done would matter to people she would never meet in ways that would not be visible for months or years, but were already set in motion by the choices of people who had been scared and chosen right anyway. She thought about what Marcus Reed had said at the formation. The person who stays calm while everyone else loses control. She had always thought of that description as tactical, as a skill, as something you trained for. Walking across Pendleton in the evening, she understood it differently. It was not a skill, it was a belief that the truth was worth the patience it took to reach it, that the right outcome was worth the steadiness required to protect it from collapsing under pressure before it could become real. She had believed that for 9 years. She believed it still. The gate was ahead of her. Tomorrow she would be somewhere else, reading a different file, walking into a different base, or a different building, or a different room full of people who didn't know who she was. Tonight she was still here, and here was enough. She was gone before most of the base woke up. No ceremony, no farewell formation, no official departure with salutes and handshakes and the performance of significance. Olivia Hayes had checked out of her temporary quarters at 430, signed the last of her administrative paperwork, and walked to the waiting vehicle, with her notebook under one arm and her bag over the other shoulder. The same way she had arrived 7 days ago, quietly, without announcement, without asking anyone to acknowledge the weight of what had just happened. The only person who knew she was leaving at that hour was Marcus Reed. He was standing near the main gate when the vehicle pulled up, not because anyone had told him to be there, but because 24 years had given him the particular instinct of knowing when something was ending and needing to be present for it. He wasn't in full uniform. He had his jacket on over his PT clothes, like a man who had gotten up in the middle of the night because something mattered more than sleep. Olivia saw him. She stopped. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "No," Marcus agreed. "I didn't." They stood for a moment in the early morning dark. "How's the unit?" she asked. "Awake," he said. "In a way it hasn't been in a long time." He paused. "Scared too. Change scares people, even change they needed. But awake is better than what we had." "Yes," Olivia said. "It is." Marcus looked at her. There was something in his face that he was working to keep organized, the particular emotional architecture of a man who didn't express things easily, and understood that this was probably the last time he would speak to this woman, who had walked into his unit like a quiet storm and left it fundamentally different than she found it. "I've been in 24 years," he said. "I've had commanding officers I respected. I've had some I didn't. I've had moments that made me proud of what I do, and moments that made me question all of it." He paused. "This week watching you work, I understood something I didn't fully understand before. About what real authority looks like, what it costs. What it's for." He stopped. "I just wanted to say that before you left." Olivia looked at him steadily. "The unit is better because of you," she said. "Not because I came in. Because you held it together long enough for it to be worth saving. Don't forget that part." Marcus nodded once. "Safe travels, Commander Hayes." "Take care of them." Gunnery Sergeant Reed. She got in the vehicle. He watched it go until the taillights disappeared through the gate. Then he stood alone in the dark for a minute, which was the amount of time he allowed himself, and then he turned and walked back toward the barracks. Because there was a unit behind him that was going to wake up in 2 hours, and it was going to need something solid to orient to when it did. He intended to be that thing. That was the job. That had always been the job. 3 weeks after Olivia Hayes left Camp Pendleton, the formal proceedings against Lieutenant Colonel Richard Harmon produced their first official outcome. He was relieved of command pending the full review, which was expected to take 4 to 6 months. The language of the official notification was bureaucratic and bloodless, as such language always was. But the fact of it moved through the military network with the speed of things that people had been waiting to see confirmed. Major Karen Shields assumed interim command. Her first act was to restore the formal complaint process to full operational function with an independent oversight mechanism, a specific protocol, with named accountability at each stage. That meant a complaint could no longer be rerouted or disappeared by a single person at a single level. Her second act was to send a unit-wide communication that was 2 paragraphs long and said, in the direct language of someone who had been waiting to say it, that the environment of the past 18 months was over. That the people who had stayed silent out of fear were not failures. That the people who had spoken and been punished were owed accountability. And that the path forward was going to be built on what this unit actually was, rather than what one man had decided it should appear to be. She did not call it brave to send that communication. It was her job, but the people who received it understood the difference between a leader who did the job because they had to and one who did it because they believed in it, and Karen Shields believed in it. And that came through every word of 2 paragraphs in a way that no amount of additional language could have conveyed better. Ethan Brooks read it 3 times. Then he went to find Ryan Foster. Ryan was in the mess hall, coffee in hand, rereading it on his own phone, with the expression of someone trying to decide if they were allowed to feel relieved yet. "It's real," Ethan said. "I know you don't look like you know." Ryan set his phone down. "I've been here for 2.5 years. I've watched a lot of things get announced and not happen. Forgive me if I'm holding my breath." Ethan sat down across from him. "Shields is different." "How do you know?" "You've been here 8 months." "Because she sent 2 paragraphs," Ethan said. Someone who's performing would have sent 12. She said exactly what needed to be said and stopped. He paused. Commander Hayes did the same thing. The people who know what they're doing don't need extra words. Ryan looked at him for a long moment. You know what your problem is? What? You're going to be right about things before anyone else is ready to hear it, and that's going to make you very annoying for about the next 10 years. Ethan smiled. Noted. Ryan picked up his coffee. Reyes is coming back, he said. I heard it from Vasquez. Transfer review came through faster than expected. End of next month. Something opened in Ethan's chest that he didn't have a name for. He hadn't met Reyes. He knew her only as the person whose refusal to stop had started the chain that had ended the week, that had changed the shape of everything. She existed in his mind as something between a person and a principle, the way certain people did when you understood what they had done before you knew who they were. Good, he said. And then, because it wasn't sufficient, that's yeah. Good, Ryan nodded. Vasquez cried, he said. She'll deny it. But she did. I won't tell her you told me, smart. Inés Vasquez, for her part, had spent the 3 weeks since the formation in the particular state of someone whose long-sustained tension has finally released, and who is only now discovering how much energy that tension had been consuming. She slept more than she had in a year. She ate regular meals. She stopped checking her files every morning with the anxious, habitual caution of someone who expected them to be gone. She also, for the first time in 14 months, started talking to people. Not about the investigation that had its own process and its own boundaries, but about ordinary things. About where she was from and what she'd done before Pendleton and what she thought about the training changes that Shields was starting to implement. She had been so careful for so long that normal conversation had begun to feel like a risk, and she was only now realizing how much of herself she had locked away alongside the documents and the records, this and the careful private accounting of wrongs she had been keeping. She ran into Derek Collins on a Tuesday afternoon near the communications building. They hadn't spoken since before the formation. When they'd worked near each other in the weeks before the assessment, the dynamic had been the standard kind: Vasquez careful, Collins authoritative, neither of them anything to each other except the defined roles of their respective ranks. Now it was something more complicated, because Collins carried the specific visibility of someone who had been wrong in front of everyone and had stayed to face it, which was a different kind of burden than just being wrong. He saw her. She saw him. The moment had a choice point in it, the brief window where two people could both pretend not to have noticed each other, and neither of them took it. Vasquez, Collins said. Collins, he stopped. She stopped. They stood in the corridor with the awkward honesty of people who didn't have a script for this particular situation. I heard you built a record, he said. Over 14 months. I heard that's part of what made the whole thing work. Vasquez looked at him levelly. It was part of it. That took guts, he said. It came out direct, without performance. The kind of acknowledgement that cost something. Vasquez considered him for a moment. You staying? She asked. Not in a hostile way, in the straightforward way of someone who wanted to know. Collins looked slightly surprised by the directness. That's my intention, he said. If they let me, why? He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which was itself a change from the Derek Collins who would have had an immediate, authoritative answer to everything. Because leaving would be easy, he said, and I didn't become a Marine because I wanted to do the easy thing. Vasquez nodded slowly. Then do better, working on it, he said. She walked past him. Collins watched her go, and what was in his face was not resentment and not embarrassment. Those would have been easier to carry. What was there was something more useful, if harder, the specific, uncomfortable clarity of someone who has seen themselves accurately for the first time and is trying to decide what to build on the rubble of what they thought they were. He went back to work. The biggest shock of the 4th week came from a direction no one had predicted, and it arrived not in the form of a crisis, but in the form of a letter. It was addressed to General Walker, carbon copied to Commander Hayes at Joint Operations Command. And it came from a colonel at a base in North Carolina named Fort Brennan, who had read a limited summary of the Camp Pendleton assessment, findings, the kind of summary that circulated at a certain level of command as a cautionary document, an institutional learning artifact, and who had written to say that he recognized the pattern. Not because he had observed it somewhere else, because he was living inside it. The letter was 5 pages long. It described, with the kind of precise, anxious detail of someone who had been holding something in a pressurized container for too long, a command environment at Fort Brennan that bore the same structural fingerprints as what had been found at Pendleton. Different names, different specific incidents, the same architecture. Walker received the letter on a Wednesday morning and forwarded it to Olivia Hayes with a single line of text. "You told me units built on fear don't pass the test. Here's another one waiting to fail." Olivia read the letter in her office at Joint Operations Command, 280 miles from Camp Pendleton, surrounded by the files of the next assignment she had been scheduled to take. She read it once, then she set it down and looked at the wall. This was the thing that the work produced, that nobody told you about in advance, and that you couldn't prepare for no matter how experienced you were. It was not one unit. It was never one unit. The pattern replicated because the conditions that produced it replicated because the incentive structures that rewarded performance metrics over people existed everywhere. That performance metrics existed, which was everywhere. Because the personality type that built what Harmon had built was not unique to Harmon. Because the system's safeguards against it, the complaint mechanisms, the oversight channels, the formal protections worked only as well as the people implementing them, and the people implementing them were human, which meant they could be pressured and maneuvered and made afraid. She picked up the phone. She called Walker. "I need to read the full letter," she said. "You have it. I need the personnel file of the colonel who wrote it." "Why? Because the letter took courage," she said. "And courage is useful, but it's not the same as being able to do what needs to be done on the inside. I need to know if he has both." Walker was quiet for a moment. "You think it's actionable. I think it's exactly what Fort Brennan needs, and about 6 months before it becomes what Camp Pendleton was." She paused. "I'd rather get there before the 6 months are up." Walker was quiet for a longer moment. "Clear your current assignment," he said. "I'll have Fort Brennan's documentation to you by end of week." Olivia set the phone down. She looked at the files on her desk, the assignment she was clearing, the work that would be redistributed, the plans that would be unmade and remade, and she felt something that was not quite readiness, and not quite reluctance, but was somewhere between them. The feeling of someone who understands exactly what they are about to walk into and has never yet managed to fully insulate themselves from the weight of it. She didn't want to be insulated. That was the thing she had understood, somewhere in the middle of her third or fourth assignment, that had never stopped being true. The weight was not something to manage. It was information. It told her the work was real. It told her the people inside it were real. The day she stopped feeling, it would be the day she stopped being able to do it right. She opened a new notebook. She wrote the date. She wrote Fort Brennan. She started reading. At Camp Pendleton, Diana Reyes came home on a Thursday. She arrived in a personal vehicle with her husband driving and her 2 kids in the back seat. And she checked in through the main gate at 8 in the morning with the particular combination of exhaustion and fierce alertness of someone who has been through something and is not done processing it, but is choosing, for now, to be here. Vasquez was waiting near the housing office. When Reyes got out of the car, Vasquez was already walking toward her, and what happened in the moment they reached each other was not the composed, military-bearing reunion of 2 colleagues. It was the immediate, wordless, physical reunion of 2 people who had been in a war by different means in different places, and had both come out on the right side of it against odds that had not always looked survivable. They held on for a long time. Reyes's husband stood by the car and pretended to check something on his phone, because he understood that this moment was not for him and was bigger than he had words for, anyway. The kids were confused and patient in the way that children were when adult emotion ran past their comprehension, watch, quiet, waiting for it to resolve into something they could follow. When Reyes stepped back, her eyes were wet. She didn't wipe them. She just looked at Vasquez with the directness of someone who had decided a long time ago that she was not going to manage her emotions for anyone's comfort. "You kept the folder," Reyes said. 14 months, Vasquez said. "You sent it to your home address so there'd be a postmark." "I learned it from a legal podcast," Vasquez said. 2 in the morning, couldn't sleep, thought it sounded useful. Reyes laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and full, the kind that comes out when something is both absurd and exactly right. "You're insane," Reyes said. "You filed a formal complaint against a lieutenant colonel at your first duty station after 8 months in service," Vasquez said. "We're both insane, that's why this worked." Reyes looked at her. "Did Commander Hayes, is she still here? She left 3 weeks ago." "She's on another assignment," Reyes nodded slowly. She had known this, had expected it, but knowing and encountering the fact of it were different things. She had never met Olivia Hayes. She had spoken to her on the phone for 47 minutes and had known, from the quality of the listening on the other end, from the directness and the specificity of the answers, that she was in the presence of someone who understood exactly what this had cost. "I want to write to her," Reyes said. "I have her contact through JAG," Vasquez said. "Patel gave it to me in case there were follow-up questions." "Good." Reyes looked around at the base, at the gate she'd passed through, at the housing office behind Vasquez. She had driven past this gate dozens of times before she'd been transferred, and each time the distance between her car and the entrance had felt like a wound. Now she was standing inside it, and the feeling was not what she had expected. It was not triumphant. It was complicated in the way that genuine resolution was always layered with grief for the months that couldn't be given back, for the nights her kids had asked why they moved, for the specific cost of being right in a system that punished rightness until someone with enough authority came in and forced the accounting. But she was here. That mattered. That was real. Diana, her husband, said from behind her. He was holding their younger kid, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder. Reyes turned. She looked at her family, her actual, physical, present family that was now, finally, in the same place she was, and she breathed. "Let's go home," she said. Marcus Reed passed the housing office 20 minutes after Reyes arrived, and he saw Vasquez still standing outside, watching Reyes's car pull away toward the family quarters. He stopped beside her. "She looks good," he said. "She always looked good," Vasquez said. "She looked good when they sent her away." Harmon just couldn't see past his own ego long enough to notice. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "How are you doing, Vasquez, actually doing?" Vasquez turned to look at him. The question surprised her, not because it was inappropriate, but because direct personal questions in a unit that had spent 18 months teaching people to present rather than reveal were still something she had to readjust to as normal. "Better," she said. "Honest, not done, but better." She paused. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." "I know that sounds. It sounds like someone who lived inside a broken system long enough to stop fully trusting fixed ones," Marcus said. "That's going to take time. That's okay." He held her gaze. "But the system isn't broken here anymore. Not the same way." "That's real." Vasquez nodded. She believed him. It took her another moment to let herself believe him, because believing had become a thing that cost something, and you had to choose it deliberately. "Yeah," she said. "I know." 5 months after Olivia Hayes had walked through the restricted entrance at Camp Pendleton on a Tuesday morning in October, Ethan Brooks stood in front of a room of 12 junior Marines and delivered a training segment on what the official curriculum called ethical decision-making in command environments. He had been asked to deliver it by Karen Shields, which surprised him. He was a private, the lowest person in the room in terms of rank, and when he'd asked her why she'd chosen him, she'd said, "Because you were paying attention when it mattered. And the people in that room are going to need to understand what paying attention actually means. Rank doesn't teach that. Example does." He had spent 3 nights preparing. Not from manuals, though he read those too, but from what he had seen. From the east fence line and the formation and the documentation office and the late-night conversations with Ryan. And the moment he'd watched Marcus Reed sit down on the ground next to a man who needed correcting more than he needed commanding. He tried to translate all of it into something he could give to 12 people who hadn't been there, in language they could carry forward into situations he couldn't predict. He stood at the front of the room and looked at them. 12 faces, all young, all watching. "I want to start with a question," he said. Not a rhetorical one, an actual question. He looked around the room. "When you got here to this base, to this branch, what did you think authority was for?" Silence. Then someone in the second row, a Marine named Chen, who had been at Pendleton for 3 months, said, "For getting things done." "Okay," Ethan said. "What else?" "Maintaining order," someone else offered. "Accountability," said a third. Ethan nodded. "All of those are right. But I want you to think about something. Every one of those things, getting things done, maintaining order, accountability, can be achieved through 2 completely different mechanisms." He paused. Fear or trust. He let that sit for a moment, and they looked the same from the outside for a while. The unit performs. Standards are met. Metrics look good. And then something happens, some pressure, some crisis, some moment of real difficulty, and the unit built on fear collapses. And the unit built on trust holds. He told them about the past 5 months. Not all of it, there were ongoing proceedings that required discretion. But the shape of it, the woman who had walked in without rank showing. The system that had learned to silence people, the ones who had held on anyway, Vasquez, Calloway, Nakamura, Reyes, and what their holding on had produced. He didn't tell it as a triumph, he told it as a cost. Because it had been a cost. Every person who had held on had paid something real, and the fact that the holding on had eventually worked did not refund what they had spent. And pretending otherwise would have been the exact kind of comfortable false narrative that had allowed the broken system to sustain itself. "Here's what I want you to take out of here," Ethan said, near the end. "Not a rule, not a regulation, a question you ask yourself." He looked at them. "When you are in a position of authority over someone, any authority, any size, even just being senior to one other person in one specific situation, ask yourself, am I using this authority to protect them or to protect myself?" He let it land. That question, consistently, every time, is the whole game. Everything else is details. The room was quiet. Chen raised his hand. "What if the system above you doesn't let you protect people?" Ethan looked at him. "Then you document, you report. You find the right channel, and if that channel fails, you find the next one. You keep the record." He paused. "You don't stop. That's the lesson. The people who changed what happened here didn't change it by having power. They changed it by refusing to stop." After the session, as the room was filing out, Chen stopped beside Ethan. "Who was she?" he asked. "The commander. What's she like?" Ethan thought about it. He thought about the way she had walked through the gate on that first morning, before he'd known who she was, and how even then there had been something in her movement that his body had registered as significant before his brain had caught up. He thought about the documentation office window and the notebook that never stopped filling. He thought about the phone call at 4 in the morning to Walker. The 47 minutes with Reyes. The 2 underlines in her notebook. The way she had told Collins, "Keep that thought, write it down if you need to. But keep it." She's the kind of person, Ethan said, who walks into a room where nobody knows who she is, and changes everything anyway. He paused. "And then she leaves, before anyone can make a big deal out of it." Chen nodded slowly. "That sounds lonely." Ethan thought about that. "I think it sounds like a calling," he said, "which is not the same thing." The letter Reyes wrote to Olivia Hayes was 4 pages long. It took her 2 weeks to write, not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because what she wanted to say kept expanding past the container she tried to put it in. She wrote it by hand, which felt right in a way she couldn't articulate. There was something about the permanence of ink that the situation seemed to require. She wrote about what the 14 months away had cost. She wrote about the nights her daughter had cried because she missed her friends. She wrote about her husband's face on the phone calls when he was trying to be supportive and she could see it costing him, too. She wrote about the specific terrible moment of filing the formal complaint with JAG from 29 Palms and not knowing if anyone would ever pick it up and use it. She wrote about the phone call, the 47 minutes. The moment Hayes had said you were right, it worked, come home, and what those 5 words had done to her in a parking lot in 29 Palms at 9 o'clock at night. And then she wrote, I've been trying to figure out what to thank you for. I keep thinking the answer is the investigation, or the report, or the proceedings. But I don't think that's it. I think what I want to thank you for is that you came in as nobody, on purpose, so you could see us as we actually were. Not performing, not adjusted, real. And you believed that what you found in the real version of us was worth the work of fixing it. You saw something worth saving in a place that had almost convinced itself it wasn't. That's the thing I don't have a better word for than grace. Olivia Hayes received the letter at Fort Brennan, where she was 6 days into her 9th independent command assessment, walking the base as nobody, watching, writing in a new notebook. She read it once, standing in the temporary office she'd been assigned, still in her plain tactical uniform with no insignia and no rank on display. She folded it carefully. She put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, close. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work, because somewhere in this base right now, there was a junior officer who was afraid to file a report. There was a complaint that had been filed to the wrong channel and had not yet surfaced. There was a Marine who was performing when they should have been speaking. There was a gunnery sergeant who was holding something together by himself, 'cause nobody above him was willing to hold it with him. There was a private paying attention, asking himself the right questions, not knowing yet that his paying attention was going to matter. There was always someone like that, and they deserved someone who would come in without a flag flying, without rank announced, without anything but the absolute, unshakable conviction that the truth was worth the patience it took to reach it. Commander Olivia Hayes straightened her notebook on the table. She wrote the date, she wrote a name, she started the work. Because the truth did not move by itself. It needed people who were willing to carry it forward through the places that resisted it most, with nothing to show but their own steadiness and the conviction that what was right was worth the cost of making it real. And that kind of person did not stop. That kind of person never stopped. That was the whole point, and it always had been.